In 2009, I got a call. No, I lied. It was 2008. Sorry, I'm mixing up my dates. I got a call from Dexter Filkins. Dexter is a very well-known war correspondent, and he used to work for the New York Times, and now he's with the New Yorker magazine. And Dexter and I had worked together for almost a decade at that point. And we were together in Afghanistan, Iraq, and he's a funny person. He talks to everyone in the same tone. Doesn't matter who he's speaking to. So he called me up and he said, "Hey dude, I got a great story." I said, "Yes, Dax?" And he said, "It's on the Talibanization of Pakistan." And I sort of rolled my eyes. And my husband, who was then my boyfriend, looked at me and said, "You're not meeting the Taliban." And I said, "I'm not going to answer." I said, "I've known better than to answer." So I didn't say anything. Dexter went ahead to the tribal, he went ahead to the Northwest Frontier Province in Pakistan. And he started setting up access. And many of the stories we do as journalists, we rely on local translators and drivers to set things up for us. They provide much of our access. They know who to trust, and they're fundamental to our work. And so Dexter spent over a month setting up access. And the night before we were leaving to meet the Taliban, we got a call from Haji Namdar's guys, and Haji Namdar was the Taliban commander. And they said, "You are welcome to come tomorrow, but the one thing you cannot do is bring a woman." So Dexter and I thought, oh no, what will we do? So we said, "We are not separating." And our translator was tormented. He said, "I don't know, Haji Namdar said we can't bring a woman, but we can't leave you here." And so he said, "I have an idea. You can be Mr. Dexter's wife." And Dexter would never leave his wife alone in a strange city, so you must come. And I said, "Okay, whatever, I'll be his wife." So we dressed up, and I was completely veiled. And we go, and we drive into a tribal area. And the tribal area in Pakistan is prohibited for all foreigners. And we drove in, and we end up at Haji Namdar's house, and they invite me in, and Dexter says, and we're in a room, a very small room, with all Taliban fighters. There were 15, 20 of them, with their weapons, everything. And we walk in the room and sit down. And in Pashtun culture, if it's a tribal culture, and if a Pashtun invites you to his home, he will protect you with his life. That is the code of honor in that part of the world. So we knew that we were protected by him and his men. The real issue was on the way back or on the way there, if any other group of Taliban had caught us, we would have been killed. So we're sitting in this room, and Dexter says, "Haji Namdar, this is my wife, thank you for letting her come." And Haji Namdar says, "You are welcome." He doesn't look at me, and then Dexter says, "My wife has a camera, do you mind if she takes some pictures?" So I took pictures. And then halfway through the interview, everyone started getting very fidgety. And I thought, oh no, this is where they're going to kill us. I said, "We're so stupid, why do we stay so long?" And so a man came over to me and he says, "Madam, we would like for you to drink tea, but you cannot drink tea through your veil in a room full of men." And I said, and Southern hospitality, you must all understand this. So they said, "Please go stand in the corner of the room, face the wall, lift up your veil, drink your tea, and then you can come back and join us." So the Taliban made me drink their tea. And in November of 2009, I was working on a story for National Geographic magazine on women in Afghanistan. At this point, I had been working in Afghanistan for 9 years. I started going when it was under Taliban rule, and I have gone every year since. And one of the issues I really wanted to cover for National Geographic was the issue of maternal mortality, which is women who die in childbirth. Afghanistan has one of the highest rates of women who die in childbirth in the world because there aren't many roads. So when a woman is in labor, she often has to walk 10 to 12 hours to get to a hospital. And if she can't walk, they put her on the back of a donkey. So many women die in childbirth. So I was working in the villages and going to where midwives go and documenting the access, the poor access for women, pregnant women. And on the way back, my translator, Dr. Ziba, and I saw these two women on the side of the road. And we said, "That's strange, there's no man with them," because in that part of the world, all women have a man with them. And so we stopped the car, and Ziba and I ran up and said, "What's happening? Why are you here?" And it turned out that Noor Nisa on the right was in labor, and she thought her water had just broken, and she was a young woman, And her husband's first wife died in childbirth, and he was so determined to not let her die that he rented a car, and people from the village chipped in. It's a big expense for someone in a village in Afghanistan. And that car broke down. And so when I found them, they were waiting for another way to the hospital. It was still a good 2.5-hour drive. So I said, come in my car, I'll drive you to the hospital. And they said, well, we need permission from her husband. We can't get in a stranger's car. So I looked at Ziba and I said, go find her husband. And there was one road that went through the entire province. So she took our car and she found my husband. She brought him back, and I drove the whole family to the hospital, and she delivered. And I did not photograph. Everyone asked me if I kept photographing, and I did not, because for me, at the point in which I changed the story with my presence, I didn't think it would be ethical to keep shooting. In 2011, I wanted to cover the Arab Spring and the uprising in Libya. So I snuck in to Libya through Egypt. All the journalists covering the uprising in Libya had snuck in through Egypt because Gaddafi did not want journalists covering the uprising. So almost immediately after arriving in late February, combat started. And we all thought, as journalists, we all thought the uprising would be similar to what happened in Egypt, that it would be a popular uprising and there wouldn't be fighting. But we were wrong. And I wanted to show you this picture just to show you this is what the front line looked like. So literally, a lot of these fighters were not indeed fighters. They were just young men, engineers, teachers, doctors, who took up arms and tried to fight Gaddafi's military. And there were airstrikes against us every day. So, for example, we'd be on the front line and you would hear the hum of an aircraft, and everyone would sort of look up and hope that a bomb didn't land on us. And often it landed right next to us, and there was no telling where bombs would land. For about 2 weeks straight, and was actually just about to pull back east to Benghazi. And myself and 3 colleagues for the New York Times were kidnapped by Gaddafi's troops. We were covering the front line, and we were in the city of Addario. And the front line was moving very quickly. Gaddafi's troops were gaining ground very quickly towards us, and we knew that the city would fall. But as journalists, we always want to stay as long as we possibly can to get the best, most recent reporting. So there were 4 of us for the New York Times in one vehicle, and 4 of us had very different opinions about how long we should stay and what we needed. The writers needed one thing, photographers needed something else. And so by the time we made a decision to leave, Gaddafi's troops had set up a checkpoint in front of us, and we drove directly into it. There was some debate as to whether we should try and drive through it and risk getting open fired on, or if we should stop and announce ourselves as foreign journalists. At that point, Gaddafi had made many announcements saying, if you see foreign journalists, they're all spies and you should kill them. So we knew that it was a risk, that if we ran into Gaddafi's troops, we might get killed. So our driver panicked, and he stopped the car at the checkpoint. And in the moment he stopped the car, the rebels that we had been covering opened fire on the checkpoint we were at. So we were caught in the crossfire, and there were bullets everywhere. Our driver jumped out to the left, everyone else crawled out to the right, and immediately each one of us had one of Gaddafi's troops on us with a gun to us, and they were trying to take our stuff. And when there are bullets everywhere, the priority is to get out of the line of fire. And so there was a cement building off to the right. This is a picture of exactly where we were. If you see the name Brian Denton, he's a freelance photographer who went back 2 weeks after we were released to help look for our driver's body. Our driver was killed. And if you see where his name is, that's pretty much exactly where our car was stopped. And the cement building that we ran behind is there. And so we all 4 successfully made it behind the building. We never saw our driver again. And they asked us to lie face down on the ground and put guns to our heads. And they were deciding whether to execute us. And we each had a gun to our heads, and we pleaded for our lives. And eventually they decided not to kill us. Instead, they tied us up and put us in vehicles on the front line and watched us as we were completely helpless, and artillery and bullets rained around us. And as the fighting got closer once again, they moved us in a different position. And for 6 days we were held captive. The first 3 were very violent. We were beaten up, tied up, threatened with death over and over, and then we were flown to Tripoli, and eventually we were released on the 21st of March. When Brian went back, he found my shoe on the side of the road, and that's my shoe without the laces because they tied me up with my laces. And that's it.
Emotional defense mechanisms must you build up to do what you do?
It's tough. I mean, I get emotional. I'm not the kind of photographer who doesn't get involved. I definitely do, especially because I often witness people dying on camera. So I think when I'm shooting and I have my responsibility is to actually capture the story, I try to keep the camera to my face because I find that I'm able to sort of shield myself from emotion a little bit. But it doesn't always help. I mean, sometimes I just break down. And I was doing a story in Uganda on breast cancer victims, and that was a tough story because I spent about 10 days with these women, and at the end, one of the women I was photographing died, and it was really sad because I had gotten to know her family, and I witnessed her daughter coming to say goodbye to her, and it was horrible. And at the end, when she passed away, I missed half of my pictures because they were all out of focus because I was crying so hard. So I try to stay, removed, but it's not always possible.
How did you make the decision to go into war zones? And I'm hoping you can discourage my daughter here, who's an inspiring photographer.
I always say to people, you don't want me to meet your daughter, I promise. It sort of happened. There was not a linear path. I never wanted to be a war photographer. So I grew up in Connecticut, and I was always interested in life overseas. And I studied international relations and had photographed as a hobby, but I never considered photography as a potential profession. I just didn't think, I thought it was sort of just something people did on the side. And after I graduated from University of Wisconsin, I moved to Argentina. I sort of saved my money and said, I'm gonna go learn Spanish. And I moved to Argentina on my own, and there I started becoming aware of the newspaper and the images in the newspaper and how powerful images could really make people think and how they could tell stories. And suddenly I had this epiphany of, photojournalism is exactly that. It's sort of the marriage of photography and international relations and telling stories. And so then I moved to India in 2000 to do the same thing, to sort of go overseas and try and actually start photographing. And when I was in India, this was before September 11th, but many of the correspondents based in India were covering Afghanistan under the Taliban because it was right there. And the Taliban was giving visas to journalists to actually cover the situation because the Taliban believed in 2000 that they were bringing order to Afghanistan, because in fact they had been when there was a war going on with the Mujahideen, and Afghanistan was rife with fighting everywhere, and the Taliban actually came in at one point in the mid-90s and brought stability. Of course it was complete oppression, but so they wanted journalists to see that. So they actually invited journalists in. And at that point, that's when I started covering Afghanistan. And it never dawned on me to not go because my colleagues were all going. And so I sort of saved my money. I was 26 years old and I went to Afghanistan. And I couldn't get an assignment because no one knew my work. And I went and I just started photographing women's lives under the Taliban because I had access to women. And the Taliban couldn't come into their homes because they were men. And although photography of any living thing was illegal under the Taliban, when I had access to women in their homes, I could sneak around and take pictures. And so I really was learning, what I had learned with the transgender story, that I have to gain trust, and then I was learning to use my gender to my advantage. And so once I had worked in Afghanistan, I then covered, after September 11th, the New York Times put me on assignment to cover Pakistan and the fall of the Taliban. And then when Iraq was going to happen, it was a natural sort of, I wanted to be there because it was important for me as an American to be there to witness what was happening with our country.
Just a two-part question. What was the dialogue / morale like in the time that you were captured and released, like with you guys and your captors? What were those days like? And then second of all, just Where were you on 9/11?
I was in Mexico City because I stayed in India for a year, and then I moved to Mexico City to continue working with a correspondent I'd been working with. But when the attacks of September 11th happened, I was basically on the first plane back to Pakistan, Afghanistan. So technically I was living in Mexico, but I went to Pakistan. I arrived on the 21st of September. That's an interesting question. No one's asked that. That's exciting about the dialogue. So when we were first taken captive, we were all terrified, of course, to speak to each other. And because initially we were not blindfolded, when they first tied us up and placed us in vehicles, we were not blindfolded for the first few hours. And so we knew when people were close enough to hear us. And we didn't speak very openly. We were scared, really, to anger anyone. So we were very timid with our how much we communicated. But there were a few words that we spoke to each other. And then at one point, when the fighting got really bad, and I think they realized maybe we don't want our captives killed, because I think they realized at some point, like, we served them better if we were alive. They put us on the ground, almost underneath the vehicle and behind the cover of a truck that wasn't armored, but it was a truck. And they put a mattress down and let the four of us lie like sardines almost together. And they kept us there for like 4 hours. And that was the first time we were able to really do a little talking to each other. But again, we were scared. And then at like 2 in the morning that night, they moved us to another location and they blindfolded us. And at that point, we were blindfolded for a while. So the only thing we said to each other was, Steve Farrell said, "Is everybody here?" And we all answered yes, because we wanted to make sure that we weren't separated from each other. And luckily, we were never separated from each other. And Anthony Shadid spoke Arabic, so sometimes he was able to translate a few things to us that were important for us to know. Like, for example, that they were debating whether to execute us in that moment. And then he would translate when they would say the fighting's getting very close. But he did it in a way that, very few words, because we were really scared. And then at some point we were put in a prison cell together, the four of us in one cell, and they left us alone, so we spoke. We assumed that there was some we were mic'd or that we were being listened to, but we spoke about personal things.
Well, there are certain moments where that things would happen or something would happen that you would think, oh, okay, we've got a shot at getting out of it, something like certain moments.
Yeah.
Of hope.
There were sort of an equal amount of moments where we were sure we were dead and then sure that we would get out. And I think that is they understood how to instill fear. I mean, that's sort of what they're very good at, psychological trauma, but also physical trauma. So they would beat us up really heavily and then say, okay, we're going to be nice to you now. And then they would beat us. Or, one time, one night, this man was just caressing my cheek while I was tied up and blindfolded and touching my hair, and then he was saying something over and over, and Anthony said, he's telling you he's going to kill you tonight. So it's a very sort of sick back and forth. And so the one thing that we agreed on was that if they brought us to Tripoli, we would probably live, because that's where the government was. And once you bring 4 New York Times journalists to Tripoli, you kind of have to account for them.
Like when you go in a certain area, do you have somebody that you contact to make sure, like when it's changing?
So all journalists have like a local translator, we call like a fixer translator.
Okay.
And usually it's not a stranger, it's someone who's worked with our colleagues or works with the New York Times, and they are everything. I mean, none of us could do this job without them. And so often we'll send some information about the stories we want to do, and then they'll start setting it up and lining up access. And then on the ground, we're together all the time, and with the driver. And so we're like a team. I mean, we cannot operate separate.